And Osman, salam alaikum and greetings to all friends.
Yes. So thank you so much for joining today's evening. So let us begin the session with an invocation of a song of Rabindranath Tagore. So let me share the screen. Thank you so much for your kind attention. It was kind of divine song. Namaste. I, Randhir Kumar Gautam, on behalf of Swadhyasa Chakra family, Vishwanidham Center for Asian Blossoming, I welcome you. It's a great pleasure and indeed an honor to have available with us our distinguished speaker, Professor John Robert Clemer from Jindal Global University, Sonepat, India. I also welcome Professor Anant Kumar Giri from Madras Development Institute. Today is a very special occasion. Today's occasion of Chitranjan Das Memorial Lecture. So before the lecture, let me give a brief introduction to our honorable speaker, Professor John Clemer. Professor Dr. John Clemer is a professor of sociology in JSLH and has been one of the faculty of Jindal Global University for the last 5 years. Prior to that, he was a professor of comparative sociology and also Asian studies at Sophia University, Tokyo, Japan, and then professor and advisor to the doctor at the United Nations University. He has taught and researched all around the world and has held regular or visiting posts at Oxford, Webinar, Australian National University, Pondicherry, Singapore, so on and so forth. He currently works mainly on the interface of culture and development, the sociology of art, and the issue of sustainability. But in the course of his career, has roamed through just about every area of sociology and anthropology. Let me give a brief introduction to Professor Chitranjan Das also. Professor Chitranjan Das is a creative soul seeker and transformative thinker and activist of our times, who has written and worked many aspects of human lives, education, philosophy, literature, and integral human development and social transformation. Chitranjan Das was born on 3rd October 1923 in Bhagalpur in the undivided district of Cuttack in Odisha, India, and left his mortal body on January 16, 2011. Chitranjan Das is known to many of his friends, co-travelers, and concerned publics at large in Odisha and India as Chittabhai. Chittabhai has initiated many creative experiments. He founded Jivana Vidyalaya, School of Life in Champadip Munda in 1950. He was a prior in the integral education movement of Odisha and translated major works of Maharshi Sri Aurobindo and Mother to Odia. He nurtured both Egargami and Nava Pallava creative efforts in education and tribal development in Odisha. He wrote and translated around 250 books, a majority of them being in Odia and some of these in English. So with this brief introduction, now I would like to invite Professor Anant Kumar Giri sir to kindly moderate the session. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Randhir. Sat Sri Akal. And again, a warm welcome. Konnichiwa to our dear friend and nurturing thinker co-present, Professor John Clemer, and all friends co-present this evening to work and meditate with the thoughts and the pathways that Chittabhai has left with us, inviting us to work and meditate further. We are very enriched that in our midst today, we have our dear friend Petri from Finland. And as I was speaking with him, Petri met Chittabhai when he went to Finland in 1950s to work with the folk high school movement there. And Petri's father was the director, the headmaster of a high school, and they worked together. And many other friends, our dear friend Osman and Saji. So Professor John Clemer is really a friend of the world, a Chittabhai, and the way Chittabhai also crossed many borders, as John has written initially in a book we did in dialogue with Chittabhai in 2011, which was published in 2013. Towards the end of John's contribution, John writes about Chittabhai. Any engagement with the work of Chitranjan must then agree that he is not just an indigenous writer producing literature in a not widely read language in a neglected corner of a developing country. On the contrary, his work contains a model for engagement with the world, one that crosses the boundaries of literature as conventionally understood, sociology, literary history and criticism, social criticism, philosophy, and folklore. It is clear that the objective of this intervention is not simply critical, but more one of affirmation, of encouragement, and of drawing attention to the rich, imaginative, and creative resources inherent in almost any society, and certainly in his native Odisha. So this theme that John writes about Chittabhai, John also embodies this border crossing striving, sociology, anthropology, cultural studies, and much more so, a critical and creative engagement with the present and finding pathways to possible alternative human futures. And it is a mark of John's remarkable and inspiring attentiveness that John describes the works of many people that he meets, either physically or spiritually. John has not met Chittabhai physically, but once he started reading his work, one can feel this sense of deep journey that John undertakes with a fellow traveler like Chittabhai. And he has discussed a bit about Chittabhai's work in his book also, Art and International Development. So it is a joy for us to be enriched by the co-traveling thoughts and visions, and John gives a lot of importance to creative imagination as a force in society, especially helping us to take us out of the predicament that we are. And in fact, Chittabhai was always deeply engaged with futures that we cultivate with our vision and striving. Therefore, the theme of today's lecture is very much in tune with the lifelong sadhana and strivings of Chittabhai. With this, it is a joy for us to be enriched by John. Looking forward to.
Thank you so much, Ananta. And Randhir for the invitation to give this lecture. It's an honor and a pleasure for many reasons, including, as Ananta said, I never, in fact, had the great pleasure of actually meeting Chittabhai in person. And in fact, he's a figure who is much neglected, I think, and even probably amongst even Indian sociologists or social theorists, writers, his name would not necessarily be terribly well known. And I hope this lecture series, amongst other things, will indeed bring him back into the kind of prominence that he, I think, very, very well deserves. So let me turn to my theme about learning with Chittabhai. What can we do? Now, there are different ways, of course, in which we can approach any kind of creative thinker. I mean, one way, of course, is through a close analysis and of their work. And, you know, if you think about someone like, say, William Shakespeare, there must have been tens of thousands of books written about Shakespeare. People still, I'm sure, are examining his work from every possible angle, and as ideas in social theory and psychology expand, no doubt that tradition will maintain as well. And that would be one way of approaching Chittabhai's work, but that's not the approach I want to take at all. What I want to ask, to raise the question and try to answer it a little bit in the next 30 or 40 minutes is, what can we learn from Chittabhai? Something, the kind of the almost eternal messages, I think, which are in his work, and which we should spend some time trying to expand on and trying to perhaps make better known to the wider world. Now, as we know, and Ananta himself has provided a kind of, at least a bibliography, a partial bibliography of his extraordinarily prolific work, prolific thinker, writer, translator, practical educationalist, sociologist, writer in many kinds of fields, fiction and non-fiction. As a writer myself, I really wonder how anybody can keep up this kind of productivity. But I always think of Gandhiji in this respect too. As you know, his collected works now run to 100 volumes, I think literally 100 volumes of Gandhiji's writings, despite the fact that, like Chittabhai, I mean, both of them were heavily engaged in Gandhiji's case, of course, his political life, but in Chittabhai's case, of course, very much this engagement with education, a theme I'd like to return to in a moment. So we see, I mean, in his own right, he would be someone worth considering seriously, simply by the sheer range and productivity of his work, his writing and his practice. But I think we can take it a little further, and that's what I'd like to touch on for a few minutes. I mean, as we're all aware, I think we're facing unprecedented problems in the contemporary world. That depressing list that we're all familiar with of climate change, of course, is one of the primary ones. Pollution, loss of biodiversity. The world still seems to be riddled with conflict, terrorism of one kind or another, the rise of various forms of fundamentalism. All of these things are happening around us. And this is a very remarkable period to be living through, I think, because although individually some of these problems have existed in the past, I don't know if there's any period in recent history where they've all come together at the same time. So, we face immense challenge actually living at this moment in history. And I think that challenge, if we are going to respond to it in a sensible and ethical kind of way, asks us at least two questions. One is, in fact, how we formulate alternatives. Mrs. Thatcher, the one-time Prime Minister of Britain, of course, was notorious for amongst her various sayings, coming out with the famous phrase, "There are no alternatives." Her view of late modern neoliberal capitalism, which she promoted, of course, actively, she saw as being in rather the sense that Francis Fukuyama in another context also says the kind of end of history. There was no point in really thinking about alternatives because these were simply pipe dreams. These were maybe utopian projects, but would have no real leverage, if you like, on the real world and affecting that real world. And I think to go along with that view is in fact an incredible lack of imagination, a loss of imagination, a very, very dangerous loss of imagination. We need, in fact, to think about how we can formulate alternatives to the negative processes that have brought us into our current range of planetary crises. That's one side of the picture. The other side of the picture is what tools can we find? What methodologies can we find for promoting that kind of positive transformation? Now, what I mean by tools or methodologies in this context is that, it's not so very difficult to come up with plans. The 19th century, for example, was full of utopian thinkers. Some of them are very fascinating people to still read today. Marx, of course, famously rejected them as the so-called utopian socialists. So the problem with these people is they have lovely ideas, but they have no methodology for translating those ideas or ideals into practice. And of course, Marx thought that he did, that he had a scientific technique or set of methodologies through which, his body of ideas could be in fact translated to practice. And as we know, successfully or unsuccessfully, there are plenty of people who have indeed tried to do that. Of course, as we know, throughout the world, the Soviet Union, in China, Cuba, and many other societies. So we can argue about how successful that was in practice, but at least Marx showed that you needed a methodology to reach the kind of to create the kind of social changes that your ideas or ideals might point to, but we need a way to reach them. When I think we look at the work of Chittabhai, we see many clues as to how to formulate those kind of methodologies or tools. And that's what I really want to open up a little bit in the next few minutes. The word radical, when you often hear it, and I think it often has for many people rather negative connotations. To be radical is to destroy, to be radical is to overthrow things. And of course that can be true. There are those forms of destructive radicalness. But of course, the roots of the word, the basis, the root of the word radical is in fact the concept of roots. To go to the depth of things and to try and find out where the deep levels of the processes that create the world we see around us, and it might transform it. If we can understand those mechanisms, of course, we're in a much better position to transform things. And I think, and I'll try to convince you, if you need convincing at all, which you probably don't, that in Chittabhai's work, we find some very, very interesting approaches to what those kind of tools might be. Not only those tools, but something which I think pervades his work, which is accepting that the transformation of the world is possible. That may sound a surprising thing to find, but I constantly meet people who are extremely pessimistic about the future. Things can only get worse. In fact, even can be nihilistic about this. What's the point, in a way, of engaging ourselves with the world, which is running down into chaos? It's heating up. There's no sign of the end of the kind of conflicts, of the power of the dominant economic system, and of course its effect on creating pollution and climate change and other forms of inequality. Ending up feeling very disempowered. What can we do about this? But I think that when we look at Chittabhai's work, we see that, of course, he rejects that idea entirely. There are alternatives, and what we have to do is to seek together for effective methods to affect that world. Now, what were those methods? What are those methods? And I would like to pick out just three. Amongst his prolific writing, there are many, many themes, but I'd like to pick three key ideas. I think I would recommend to you, we can think of it through three portals, if you like. The first of those is literature. Now, as we know, Chittabhai was himself a prolific writer, writing across a whole range of genres, children's books, school textbooks, fiction, all sorts of things. And I think in doing this, he was not wasting his time at all. He would put his finger on something which is a key to understanding the way in which human cultures operate, which is that we are a storytelling species. narratives shape our lives in profound kind of ways. What I mean by that is, well, if you could take actual examples. I mean, if you think of one of the major forms of story, and I don't mean this in a negative way necessarily, but in a quite formal sense to be stories, are the scriptures of most religions. If you take the Bible, most of it shared by, of course, Jewish people and the Christian community, if you read it, you will find, of course, that a very high volume, a large part of the Bible is in fact the recounting of stories. It's the recounting of history, it's the recounting of myths and legends, it's the counting of stories of how people got to where they are, and the intervention of divine forces in shaping that kind of history. It's profoundly a narrative of the way in which the world has been shaped, and the way in which, of course, in that case, faith communities, particularly the Jewish and Christian communities in the biblical sense, have in fact been shaped by those narratives and continue to be. Now, I think if we look into our own lives, we see very quickly, if we actually analyze them, the extent to which all of our lives are shaped by narratives. Those narratives may be the kind of Thatcherite narrative. There's no alternative, so just learn to live with what you have. It's the best possible world, and you can't really find anything to improve on it. It may be narratives that we've gained from a field like science. If we look, for example, at the way in which many people have responded to the COVID crisis, you see this very quickly. There are people who've responded positively. I think the phrase I keep hearing or reading about in the newspaper is this concept of following the science. You know, the science strongly suggests that getting vaccinated is a good idea. You know, wearing a mask, maintaining social distance, washing your hands, sanitizing, and this kind of stuff will, as far as we can ever control these things, protect you from infection by the COVID-19 virus. Okay. But as we also know, there are counter narratives. And I've been out of India for some time, so I don't know quite what's happening on the ground at this moment. I'm in Japan at this moment. Is you see in the United States, for example, a counter narrative organized around a concept of freedom. You know, I am free not to wear a mask. You know, I am free not to be vaccinated. I am free to carry a gun, right? I am free to do all sorts of these things, because the most fundamental idea of those narratives is the concept of freedom. And freedom understood primarily, of course, in an individualist way. That is to say that my freedom not to wear a mask may be dangerous to you, because if, for example, I do carry the virus in some way, then of course I can much more easily spread it to you. But that's not my primary concern. My primary concern is my freedom to formulate my life along the lines that I would like to believe is the way in which I should structure my life. So in other words, you know, we're surrounded by narratives, we're surrounded by stories, and those stories are not simply fictions, important as fiction itself can be. I'm trying to remember now the name of the writer who once said that the point of fiction is that it's untruths wrapped up in a kind of truth. In other words, you may learn more about life, emotions, relationships, and so on from reading fiction, although in a sense it's untrue in the sense that it's a story, than you would from reading any number of sociological tomes, which will try to explain the same thing to you in much more turgid language, right, than a good novel would do, or a good play, or a good poem. Can obviously open you into a perception of reality very different from the formal empirical sciences. So literature then might provide us with a key. And I'd like to read you two little quotations that from quite different thinkers. One of these is one of my favorite fiction writers, an Italian, Italo Calvino, if you've ever heard his name. If you haven't, I strongly recommend his books. They're often a kind of fantasy. He plays with reality in very surrealist kind of ways, with wonderful, abusing, insightful results. But Calvino is primarily a short story writer and writes short novels, and in Italian, but most of them, I think, or probably all of them, have now been translated certainly into English. Also writes about the art of the novelist. And in one of his expositions of what he thinks the novelist is doing, he says this, I quote him here, it says, literature is necessary to politics, above all when it gives a voice to whatever is without a voice, when it gives a name to what yet has no name, especially to what language of politics excludes or attempts to exclude. I mean, aspects, situations, and languages, both of the outer and of the inner world, the tendencies repressed both in individuals and in society. Literature is like an ear that can hear things beyond the understanding of the language of politics. It is like an eye that can see beyond the color spectrum perceived by politics. Simply because of the solitary individualism of his work, the writer may happen to explore areas that no one has explored before, within himself or outside, and to make discoveries that sooner or later turn out to be vital areas of collective awareness. I think that passage could well have been written by, if not written by Chittabhai, I think if he's read it, or if he has ever read it, would, I think, be something that he would agree with. Literature is powerful precisely because it opens up those spaces of, if you like, existential dimensions of life, which may not be captured by formal social science analysis, but give us insights into those conditions which no other medium does. And in fact, I think for the arts as a whole, of course, that is one of their critical roles, is to reveal that which is often concealed behind other kinds of discourse. So literature, I think, was one of those tools that Chittabhai recommends to us as a way in which we can discover the world. So that a poem, for example, although I think perhaps many philosophers would not consider it a form of knowledge, in fact can be. It's knowledge in many cases precisely because it tells something about the world, or it tells us something about the world which would not be accessible through other media. There are other media of this kind, of course, within religious discourse, forms of mysticism, for example, I think often have the same role. What is hidden behind the formal scriptures may be revealed by mystical insight into the true meaning of those scriptures, or the deeper meaning that resides within those words, but needs drawing out before it becomes evidence. And the power of the mystic is, of course, the ability to reveal that which is hidden, although in a sense is hidden in daylight. It's there, but it requires a certain kind of insight to see it and to draw it out. The second tool, I think, that Chittabhai recommends to us, of course, in the place where he spent a great deal of his life working, is, of course, education. But a particular kind of education. Now, being I spent almost all my life in one kind of educational institution or another. I mean, whether in school myself or then in graduate school and teaching in universities across the world ever since, and I still am. And it's a form of life that I find very agreeable because it allows you, in fact, to explore the very issues that we're talking about tonight. And it's one of the few spaces left, I think, in which that possibility of exploration is still available to people. Critical, I think, to education is not just the idea that word education, but it's what it really means if you unpack it a little bit. And as I've read Chittabhai's work, I think I've discovered a set of factors which he's recommending to us that show us the way in which education should really work, as opposed to the way it's sometimes imposed on us as children, particularly when we have very little way of resisting what is happening to us. You know, we are socialized into the things that our educational system wants to train us to be. And it's much probably later in life that we begin to reflect on those things and thought maybe that was not the only possibility. What were those elements in Chittabhai's understanding of education? You know, there has been in the past sometimes that image of education as the child is the so-called tabula rasa, the empty slate to be written on, or the pot, the jug, the bottle, whatever, to be filled with the content which the educationalist is going to pour into that empty bottle. That, I think, is an idea that I think Chittabhai would have found very repugnant, precisely because I think his idea of education can be understood as not as just loading up on something, but as co-working. The teacher is not, the teacher may indeed, of course, have much more knowledge, experience than the children she or he is teaching. But that does not mean that that is a one-way path. The process of learning is really a process of discovery. And to elaborate that, to make the context available to children where they can see their education not as simply learning of fact, but of learning to think about the world, has profound effects. And indeed, I don't know if they ever really read each other's work, but what the person, and one of these sessions run by Ananta that has been on the Sunday evening ones, has been on the work of the Austrian mystic and educationalist Rudolf Steiner. Some of you may well have heard of, I think has many interesting parallel ideas with Chittabhai's ideas of education, including the idea, my own daughter was educated in a Steiner school here in Japan. There are no textbooks, for example, in a Steiner classroom. Seems a rather radical idea. How do the children learn? Well, the children learn by exploring the world under the guidance of their teacher and finding out things for themselves. So if you want to learn about botany, the secret is to go to the garden, look at plants, describe them, draw them, look at the relationship between the plant and the kind of soil that it's growing in, to look at the relation between the plants and the weather. And that kind of knowledge of botany, of course, is going to take you to a much deeper knowledge of living processes than simply reading about it in a botanical textbook. You know, it's going to give you the Latin names of plants. It's going to tell, well, these grow under certain conditions. They don't like damp weather. They don't like to be too cold or whatever. You know, that's very different from seeing for yourself how plants respond to their environment and how that affects or determines the kind of life that plant or the set of plants will in fact have. And I think that's a very important idea, that education becomes exploration. And I think a very good reason to emphasize that is for the simple reason that however long we live, however many books we read, however many graduate schools we go to, we can never do more than scratch the surface of what it would be possible to know. None of us can ever claim that we have anything like, obviously, complete knowledge of the world. That would be a totally fantastic claim to make. And if that is the case, it's not, of course, that we should not acquire knowledge, particularly in a technical field we want to exercise, right? If I go to see a medical doctor, I would like to know that he or she is in fact properly trained in medicine and has in fact studied the subject, right? Before, you know, I unleash an untrained person on my body, you know. There is, of course, knowledge that you need to know, but even in the field of medicine, of course, we discover very quickly that ideas change very, very rapidly. And one of the simplest ways of understanding that is to look at debates about nutrition. I remember seeing in a satirical magazine, it was a satirical article, but it made the point very well. It said, you know, the latest insights in nutrition, right? Nutritionists now say that apples, bananas, mangoes, they are bad for you, stroke, good for you. You should therefore never eat apples, bananas, right? Stroke, you should always eat apples, bananas. In other words, you get, you know, that completely contradictory advice as to what you should eat. You know, this is bad for you this year, but we discover next year that actually you should eat lots of it because it's terribly good for you, right? So we have to accept, therefore, that the body of knowledge is effectively infinite, at least from the point of view of human beings. Therefore, to try to fill yourself with that knowledge up to a certain point, you can do, but beyond that point, there will always be areas of the inexpressible. And I think it's probably been the experience of many of us that as we go through life, we constantly discover new things. We discover new areas of interest. We discover something we'd never thought about before. This suddenly opens up to us the fact that there is a whole new world out there about which we knew nothing. The key, therefore, is a kind of sense of curiosity, I think. It's that willingness to explore realizing that the teacher and the student are co-workers in that process of discovery, without that discovery ever having a final goal. That goal recedes as we approach it. I think also built into Chittabhai's, I don't know if we should call it theory of education, that's perhaps too rigid a word to use, but there's his praxis of education, are several other ideas which I think are equally critical that we should remember and retain all the time. Those are, in my reading of him, we can't talk about probably all of them. First of all, dignity. That the child, like any human being, should be treated as a person who has dignity, and that dignity should not be violated. I think, again, many of us have probably had experiences, say, in our school life where that dignity was violated in some way by some unfair punishment, by teasing, by being ignored by our teacher, because, you weren't the class favorite. He or she always picked on other children to answer the questions. You felt very put down. And of course, that can have long-term effects on identity of people. How do you feel about yourself? When that sense of dignity is nurtured, I think, great things happen. Any child can enter the world knowing that it is an authentic human being. And therefore, by that very knowledge, is empowered in whatever route she or he takes in life, begins from a basis which is probably one of the best foundations from which anyone, adult or child, of course, can operate. One of the terms which is reintroduced, has come back into social science discourse in the last, 4, 5, 10 years, not more than 10 years, is the notion of conviviality. The idea that the learning community is one in which people can share in an unthreatening way. I mean, we now hear this phrase, which I, again, did not hear until a couple of years ago, the idea of the safe space, the space where you can express yourself, knowing that even if you're wrong, you can be corrected, you can learn from the mistakes you've made, and you can realize that the learning space you're in is one of warmth and caring. It's a nurturative space, not a space which so many of our learning experiences are of competition, either competition between the children themselves, or competition in the sense that, all of the children, in fact, are striving maybe to be the best, to get into the best university, to get into the best something, to get into the best high school, and are constantly forced to behave in ways which I think in many cases violate their true nature and the true nature of learning. Other ideas which I think are important in Chittabhai's understanding of education, the unity of knowledge, that in fact all forms of knowledge are related to one another. A holistic position of, as far as we can attain that in practice, is I think the ideal position to take. That is to say that, as we know, in a typical university, for example, the place is divided up into a department of economics, department of sociology, department of political science, department of whatever, of psychology. But we know from our own practice, I think, that all of those areas deeply implicate all of the others. To talk about sociology without implicating the economy is almost perfect, almost impossible. And similarly, although economists often, I think, violate this rule, to try and talk about economics without understanding the social and cultural dynamics of the economy also leads ultimately to failure, to theoretical and practical failure. So knowing that, the idea of holism, I think, is an idea we should keep before us, at least as an ideal. It's not always easy to achieve it. The idea of service, both the relationship between the teacher and the student, not of one of hierarchy, but one of pointing towards the fact that the best way to change the world is not through propaganda, but it's through showing what kind of change can take place. Through service to that world is the way in which the world changes, something be life enhancing. And finally, I think, to ask about or to raise the question of the importance of the imagination, which perhaps also takes us back to that question of the role of literature. There's a poet, one of my poets I like very much, a poet by the name of Octavio Paz, whose name P-A-Z, you may know him, a Mexican poet who had a very close relationship to India. He was the Mexican ambassador to India for a number of years in the 1960s. He won the Nobel Prize in literature for his poetry. And all sorts of interesting things, including one of the ideas that I always remember. We talked about imagination, and the way Paz defined imagination was imagination, he said, is the faculty of our nature to change itself. In other words, whatever happens in the world, first of all, had to be imagined in some way, of course, before it can be really shaped and implemented. And I think that is also a critical idea. So literature, education, and thirdly, this idea of methodology. Now, whenever if in sociology classes, if you mention the word methodology, students cringe. They, oh no, more statistics, more awful ways of how to write better questionnaires and stuff like this. Although Chittabhai himself, of course, was a distinguished sociologist, I don't think that was his understanding of methodology. I think the understanding of methodology, which he points us to, is a much more fundamental one. It's asking the deep questions about society and the way it works. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that it's fairly easy for social scientists to, of course, to collect data at the level of more formal methodology. If I want to know something about consumer behavior or something, I can design a project, I can send out questionnaires, I can collect the questionnaires, process them, and then I can tell you that there is a strong relationship between something about what's happening in society and something else, between your class and your consumption of a certain product, for example, between your caste and what you eat, and all sorts of things. I can tell you those things, and that kind of knowledge is, of course, valuable. I mean, it often affects public policy, for example. If we don't know what is going on in society, we don't have facts about society, it's very hard to make policy which is effective in running, managing, or changing that society. But a deeper sense, so what do I mean by that? Some people would argue, and I think quite rightly, that we live in a society which is rich in techniques, rich in technology, rich in powerful tools, now AI, and supercomputers of immense computing power, that can do in the twinkling of an eye what it would take a whole room full of humans days and days and days to compute anything like the same data, and probably getting it wrong anyway, because if you make a mistake, it all goes wrong. But is poor in meaning. A society rich in techniques, but poor in meaning. We make more and more techniques, but not necessarily knowing what we do with them. What do those techniques do to enhance the quality of life? And I think here, again, and of course, quite naturally, there's a very strong convergence, given their intimate relationship, between Chittabhai's work and that of Sri Aurobindo. And again, I'd like to briefly quote to you something, not from Chittabhai in this case, but from Sri Aurobindo. When he's talking about the need, Aurobindo is talking about the need to close the gap between theory and practice. We have theories about how to affect the world, but we don't actually know how to do it. What kind of deeper levels can we find, where we find the levels of society where fundamental things are happening that appear on the surface, of course, as phenomena, without unnecessarily knowing what is going on under the surface. So Aurobindo says this, and again, I quote him: "A spiritualized society would treat in its sociology the individual, from the saint to the criminal, not as a unit of social problems to be passed through some skillfully devised machinery, neither flattened into the social mode or flattened out of it, but as souls suffering and entangled in a net and to be rescued, souls growing and to be encouraged to grow. The aim of its economics would not be to create a huge engine of production, whether the competitive or cooperative kind, but to give to men not only to some, but to all, whatever is his highest possible measure, the joy of work according to their own nature and free leisure to grow inwardly, as well as a simply rich and beautiful life for all. And that work would be to find the divine self in the individual and the collectivity, and to realize spiritually, mentally, vitally, materially, its greatest, largest, richest, and deepest possibilities of the inner life and of their outer action and nature. Again, I think a very profound statement from Aurobindo, which resonates with what we're talking about in relation to Chitranjan Das, meaning that essentially knowing the surface level of what happens in a society is important, as we just suggested, for making social policy, for example. In any number of spheres, of course, in any kind of public policy, in education, in healthcare, it might be a good idea, for example, if I know about diet and how it affects health, and if we have evidence of what people are eating or not eating, why children are tired and restless at school because of their inadequate diet, we can possibly make changes in how to feed our children in such a way that their nutrition is going to be enhanced, that will affect their intellectual and psychic abilities as well. So in other words, methodology is not just about finding out those surface things, but should be to, as Aurobindo, I think, suggests, should be to penetrate to much deeper levels of the fundamental dynamics of society in such a way that social policy really works. Now, any sociologist or social theory knows, of course, that one of the first principles of policy science is that no policy works in its intended ways. It may be beautifully planned. It may have been, worked out by a group of very skillful people with the best interests of everybody in mind. But when the policy is applied, it turns out to have unintended consequences, right? This happens constantly. And knowing that, of course, we should not only ask the question of how you then modify policy to make it more effective in that more surface level, but to ask the more fundamental questions about why is it that policy doesn't work in the way that it's intended to work. And to answer that question, of course, you need to understand the more fundamental dynamics of a society. That can be approached in a number of ways. And I think that's partly something, a feedback loop that takes us back to the question of literature, precisely because the kind of insights that literature or the other forms of art can provide us with are things which I think point to those deep processes in ways that more formal social analysis often does not discover. How is this revealed in Chittabhai's work? I think in lots of ways. One was indeed his work in translation. Now, I think one thing that I look for, I notice, I don't know that I actively look for it, is if I'm reading a work which is obviously been translated from another language. When you open the book, it's very good to see on the title page, it says whatever it is, A New Theory of Society by Pierre, somebody, translated by whoever. And it was, some books don't do that. Some books, the book was originally written in French, Italian, Hindi, or whatever, but there's no clue that there was, of course, a human agent who made that work available to you by the labor of translation. Translation itself is a subtle art, and I'm sure everybody in this virtual room is multilingual. And so even in everyday context, you know how difficult it is sometimes not difficult to move from one language to another in the formal sense, but how difficult it is to sometimes find the right equivalent in one language when you're trying to say something in another language that conveys as close as you can get to the meaning of that original. So translation is not just making available, valuable as that is, of course, material from another language. And sometimes that's all you need. I mean, if I need a manual on how to work my smartphone, it was originally written, my smartphone is Korean, so I can't really read much Korean, so it's no point in giving me one written in Korean, but I would like one written in a language that I can read, so that if I have to do something clever with my smartphone, I can figure out how to do it. You know, that is the basic level. But beyond that, translation, of course, is a major art in its own right, because it is the means through which other worldviews are open to us. Worldviews which we may have very little access because we do not know that language, we don't know the preoccupations of that culture. We may not understand the way in which they see the world in ways which might be radically different from the way in which we see the world. The translator, therefore, has a profound role, and that's why I think they should always be acknowledged in any work which is translated, precisely because they're the agency of revealing to us worldviews that we would otherwise not be able to access, or could only access by undertaking the major labor of learning the language. And indeed, I have met people who've done that. I don't want to rely on translations. I would like to learn a particular language because I really want to access the texts in whatever field I'm interested in their original form, and not rely on a translation. And of course, some translations are better than others. If you do know the original language, of course, I'm sure many of us have read a translation and think, no, this is not a good translation. That's not right. This is not really what is being said. Sometimes subtle, sometimes less subtle, but where the translator has missed the point. And of course, in a sense, misleads you, not deliberately, I don't think, but simply through the fact that they had not grasped the kind of inner logic of a language in the way in which really skillful translators are able to do. So this act of translation, which I think is a real act of love, it is so because in many societies, in many academic cultures, for example, I don't know I haven't tested this out in my own university in Haryana. Translation is not really considered a very important academic activity. It's nice if you do it in your part-time. Here in Japan, interestingly enough, translation is taken very seriously. If it's known that I'm working on, you haven't published much recently, say, no, I've been very preoccupied. I'm translating Ananta Giri into Japanese, because otherwise you people don't understand what he said because he only writes in English and Oriya, and so you can't read it, okay? But that would be regarded as a good, noble, and to be rewarded in terms of my academic prospects, the fact that I'm taking that effort, and it can be a very substantial piece of work, of course, to translate other people's work. But at the same time, it is also true, of course, that translation should be valued in that way. And Chittabhai, of course, devoted a huge amount of his time to making available to people who did not read certain European languages, for example, to be able to read in Oriya the kind of work that was going on in the folk high schools, for example, in Scandinavia, and other sources, which would otherwise have been unavailable to people. Or, even more confusingly in some cases, is when you have to read a translation in a language which is not necessarily your first language. So an Oriya speaker, for example, who has to read a book translated from Danish in English, even more levels of possibility of error and misinterpretation can so easily appear there. So translation, I think, is a very, very important aspect of Chittabhai's work. At the same time, the very phrase that Ananta Giri used in introducing the session, right, was this notion of border crossing. Translation itself is an act of border crossing. But I think something else is going on here as well. At my university in Sonepat, I don't know exactly what they do, but we have an office in the administrative building which has a terrible name stuck on the door. It says the Office of Transdisciplinarity. Okay, transdisciplinarity. And I think the academic bureaucrats who sit in that office are supposed to encourage us all to be transdisciplinary. And indeed, our Vice Chancellor loves that idea. He's always talking about multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, as if there was something we've simply discovered. Chittabhai, of course, had discovered this long ago, that the way, in fact, to be creative is, in fact, to be transdisciplinary, because then different traditions talk to each other in ways that they would probably not otherwise encounter one another. And because, in my experience, is often the case that the most interesting ideas come from the margin, not from the center. Now, which famous sociologist was it? Perhaps Ananta can remind me of who it was. Made a famous distinction between what he called priests and prophets. Priests were people who serve the cult. You know, if in my teaching, I teach the classical sociologists, right? And in my syllabus, I have all the classical sociological subjects. That's what you get in my department. The prophets, of course, are the people who push the boundaries. And almost by definition, of course, it will be the prophets who are the creative people. They're precisely the people who have challenged the boundaries and have drawn our attention to the fact that the really fresh ideas often come from the most surprising directions. They don't necessarily come out of the discourse of the mainstream. And, you know, I'm a social scientist, but I suspect that happens a lot in the sciences, in the natural sciences as well. You know, ideas that are outside the main paradigm, of course, are things that begin to challenge the way that dominant paradigm is structured. So in Chittabhai, I think we have a pioneer indeed of transdisciplinary, what did I say? It's transdisciplinarity. What a horrible word. Who thought of this? The first is, I don't know, right? Anyway, not by talking about it. And at OP Jindal, we had a lot of this talk, but actually doing it. That is to say, showing how this might work. There are certain costs. And I know this myself. And I ignore them to a great extent because now I'm old and a little bit famous, it doesn't matter. If, as a sociologist, for example, I publish in a journal which is not really considered a sociological journal, I publish in a journal which is about ecology, for example. I publish in something which is a journal in philosophy or regarded as such. Somebody will come along and say, well, what are you doing these days? You don't seem to be writing proper sociology anymore. Well, why not? I said, well, I mean, I just saw this article of yours. It's in some philosophy journal. I said, so, right? I mean, it can't be sociology because I publish it in a journal of sociology, of philosophy, or a journal of ecology, or a journal, whatever, okay? And if you stand back from this, of course, you realize that this is simply the priests, rather than the prophets, guarding their boundaries. What is within this box is legitimate. What falls outside the box is not. And you know, you will be criticized for this in some cases because you thought to be operating in some strange space that is outside the boundaries of your so-called discipline. Cultures vary in this respect. In France, for example, it's much easier to be transdisciplinary than it is in England. British academia is still very much divided up into its kind of departmental structures. In France, much less so. You know, people, sociologists write poetry, poets write books on sociology, artists write books on artist theory, on art theory, or on politics or something. That's considered quite normal. And here in Japan too, that is also very much the case. A lot of people operate outside their box. And it's not regarded as something negative. You haven't sold out, no longer seriously practicing your discipline because you become transdisciplinary in your activity. Two other things. One is, I think, the idea of tolerance, of listening to voices. And I think that is also an idea which is very, very important. The one context you sometimes hear the word listening is used again in the social sciences, in anthropology, particularly in a rather technical sense. If I'm an ethnographer, you know, I'm working with whatever community I'm studying, of course I need to listen, otherwise I don't know what they're saying, right? I need to listen in that technical sense, and I need to write it down, to record it, to photograph it, whatever, so I can transcribe it and put it into my monograph on my tribe, whatever it happens to be. I don't mean in that sense. I mean deep listening. Deep listening is to be in a position where you're prepared to put down your own expectations, to put down the kind of perhaps even unknown to yourself, rather rigid worldview that you bring to listening to other people, and you genuinely listen. I'm sure all of us have had the experience probably many times in life when in a conversation with someone, as you're saying something, you see them edging towards the edge of their chair because they're already preparing their answer. They haven't even listened to you yet, but they're already knowing how I'm going to respond to you. You know, a conversation turns into a kind of argument, a kind of clash of egos. You know, my insights are better than your insight, and I've already decided that in advance instead of genuinely listening. A real conversation, of course, is one which is open-ended. Neither of the participants in the conversation, or two or more people in a conversation, should really know where it's going. It should be open in the sense of revealing something to us that we were not in the previously aware of. And I think in Chittabhai's work, we find very much that idea of listening, of deep listening, and reflecting back what has been heard, not in just the ethnographic sense, I will tell you what this tribe said, what they talk about, but in a much more fundamental sense of listening to your real concerns. What are the fundamental issues, needs, vulnerabilities, whatever they may be, that you are trying to signal? And any of us, of course, I think also know this in our own personal relationships. What someone is saying and what they mean are not necessarily the same thing at all. You know, someone you know well, you can meet them and say, I don't think you're feeling well. Say, no, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm totally fine. You know they're not. There are other clues because of your willingness to see the other signs that they may be projecting to you, that in fact there is something else going on beyond what they will say to you. There's another level. We're aware of that. So in conclusion, first of all, I think what we see in Chittabhai, why his work is so interesting and should, I think, be far better known than it is that he was actually engaged in forging the tools for creating alternative futures. That is, I think, one of the most profoundly valuable things that any social thinker can do. But that, like Marx, from, of course, who he differs in just about every respect, not telling us what that future has to be like, not defining those alternatives for us, but accepting that the people who make that future will themselves decide. In other words, empowering a plurality of views and allowing those to emerge, that sense of genuine cultural democracy, rather than planning, a word which I don't like all that much, not only because policy tends to go wrong, because the very notion of planning assumes that some people, experts, know what is good for you, will plan your town, will plan your development, will plan your whatever it happens to be, in such a way that this will be beneficial to you. And I think our experience has been often, of course, that's not, sadly, always the case. Finally, again, to pick up on a notion that Ananta mentioned at the beginning, years ago in the 1940s, the famous, or became quite famous, Italian leftist writer Antonio Gramsci formulated, I think, this idea of the organic intellectual. Not the intellectual floating free of his or her society, which is very often the case with many intellectuals. You know, they talk, or we talk, we write, we speak, we pontificate, you know, while floating rather far from ever actually being able to influence in any practical way the society in which we're writing about or talking to. Nobody may be listening because we don't have that methodology, okay? What I think Gramsci meant by the organic intellectual was the person has two qualities, and I think these are exemplified very, very much in Chittabhai. One is indeed the ability through their intellectual work to influence society and to influence, of course, in positive and transformative ways. The other, equally important, is to remain rooted in their culture. It's very much the case, I think, under the impact of globalization, that cultures do tend to get flattened out. And, you know, any student who goes to even in Indian university, there are plenty of very distinguished Indian sociologists, but we'll often end up reading the great names of Western sociology because those are thought to be the people who, formulated the field. But we often don't listen to the voices generally coming from the grassroots, who precisely because of their own social and cultural historical location are truly rooted. That is to say, they are the genuine expert, not the person who's working from an abstract intellectual point of view, but who's able to speak with the voice of the people they are representing. And I think amongst many other things, we find in Chittabhai, of course, an organic intellectual in that second sense, the person deeply rooted and therefore able to speak with authenticity and power indeed from that position. And a voice, therefore, of course, which resonates in a way that we recognize as being genuinely from the soil of real experience. So thank you. I will conclude with that thought. And if we have a little time, of course, we can debate any of these issues that you would like to expand on a little bit. So back to you, Ananta Bhai.
Thank you. Arigato gozaimasu, John Bhai. and Chittabhai is in Ananda, that joy of being with a fellow traveler, like your seeking self. And many things that you have presented, you have painted together, you have woven together, they are so deep. For example, just to focus on questioning, a method of deep questioning and deep listening, they go together. And one of the early works of Chittabhai is a journey with the Himalayas called Silatirtha. And the concluding chapter is called Silatirtharu Vidaya, farewell from the Himalayas, where he's beginning with listening. And then about translation, how deep you really focusing on this. For example, he translated many works, a very huge works like Prathama Pratisruti by Asapurna Devi, a very deep woman writer of Bengal, and translated originally from Danish, the Nobel Prizing work Pilgrim Kamanita, Galeru, into Odia, and his two posthumous publications. When he left his body, he was working on a translation of some of the essays of Sri Aurobindo. So two posthumous work of him was a work of translation in Odia called Jaha Sabu Sunischita. Means whatever is certain to come, that sense of a nurtured optimism. It is an optimism that is nurtured from our striving, and a book on Spinoza in Odia. So thank you, John, for touching many important aspects of life as lived and envisioned through Chittabhai, literature, education, and method. And he also used to make a critique of methodology, that how methodology becomes methodology, and always to keep us open. So thank you. And now we nurture the ideas that John has gifted us. So let us please think together. And to initiate this, let me invite Osman, please. Osman.
Yes, I was, thanks a lot, Professor Dr. Ananta. I was writing because now I'm in Aalborg, Denmark, so I have to go back to Aarhus, where I live. Ananta is very familiar with Denmark. He has been here for many times, and he's coming back next spring if there is no pandemic. Hopefully the pandemic will be over. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. And I just want to add that John also has been to Aalborg, the university where you teach, and
Yes, right. That's
we have
right.
worked together by the waters, you know.
Yes, 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 yes. Professor John Clammer has written complimentary words for a book that I published on transnational NGOs. I sincerely appreciate for that. I think, thank you very much, Professor Clammer. This is very enlightening. Very, I have written a lot of pages. I have to digest. You know, it takes me several days to reflect what has been said. So, but I think it is very interesting. You know, I'm from political science department in Oxford University, and they really extremely focus on statistics and political science, political sociology. So we are trained in methodology. So later on, I experimented in this interdisciplinary you have mentioned, and I think it's very interesting. So now I was running away from methodology, but now, given your speech, I will be returning to methodology. I think methodology is very. what we need to do is to actually use methodology, but from a different perspective, as I understood from your lecture. I think that is very, very powerful. I also like the idea of where ideas come from. Are the ideas from the top, or are they from the bottom? I have been doing research on transnational connections, and you know, transnational connections in the world, they have this corporate transnationalism, state transnationalism. They have all of these people, because most of the people are, as you said, one of your writings. I was just not long time ago, I was reading some of your writings of social justice, where you reference Bruno Latour's entanglement, and how the world is connected. I think, but this entanglement is recognized beyond the national frame. That means if you go to the state, and if you go to the macro bureaucratic structures, they are actually practicing transnational connectedness, but they don't want to recognize it as a whole, something that is natural. We have seen a very good example from the withdrawal from Afghanistan, for example, how the withdrawal from Afghanistan, they stress the transnational connection from their own dimensions. For example, rescuing the staff, the professional staff that has been assisting the transnational intervention in Afghanistan, and not the transnational communities, diaspora communities, who have always been engaged with Afghanistan. There are people, for example, Afghans, they have had a war in 40 years. So in that 40 years, they have been, expelled from their countries, displaced as refugees, and they are scattered all over the world, like the Somalis, the Syrians, also the Indians, the Chinese, and others. So, but it's only the state dimension, is state bureaucratic dimension is always profiled. So here in Denmark, we have also a very serious challenge where, if you come up with idea, although it is welfare and very social cohesion and very empowering society, what is stressed here is the hierarchy and the bureaucracy, and modern, as you said in that social justice article, the modernization dimension. This is very, and we have seen the consequences of modernization. We have had 2 world wars. We have nuclear bombs. We have had terrorists, we have security problems. So modernization and rationalism has actually given us a lot of trouble. It is not always bad. You mentioned the mobile telephones we are using and the laptops, these are good. But on the other hand, we have very serious problems with modernization. So I really appreciate Professor John Clammer. I learn a lot from you, and I also learn a lot from Professor Ananta. And I really appreciate to link to you guys. I hope you stay healthy and you stay strong. And
thank you. May you too. Perhaps see you in Denmark.
Yeah.
Yes.
Once again.
Yes. Lovely. Your love of returning to method, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
So let us nurture more conversations, please. Friends wishing to share, you can indicate in the chat box or raise hand. So as we are moving, So let me invite our dear friend Petri from Finland. Petri Kitos. Petri. Okay. So as Petri is taking a bit of time, I request Minati, please. Minati, Maru, Sandhya Appa, and then others.
Right. Ananta, sorry, I missed you there. Sorry, Ananta.
Yes, okay. Yes, Petri. So welcome, and we wish to hear some of your thoughts, please, Petri.
I appreciate being a part of your webinar here, and it was interesting to really listen to John Clammer and his presentation. I think one thing that hit a note with me here, I was looking at, was this how he mentioned, John, that literature is powerful. And that certainly is the case in today's world. When we think of literature in a broader sense, written text and its power. A living example today is the social media and how powerful this is, and how it can have both a very positive, but it can have also a very negative impact on individuals, but also even on nations. I think as an example, interesting to read that now that we all know this COVID-19 and its tremendous effects on humans. However, despite all this knowledge, for instance, in Bulgaria, only 24% of the population has taken the vaccine, although the vaccine is very well available there. They have even had to ship vaccines to other countries from their storage before they expire, because they can't get people to come and vaccinate. And the reason is disinformation and the power of words, the power of the social media. So this is a very sort of typical example of how this can be so powerful. And it's also, I think it's a very biblical statement also, that how one's tongue is like a ship's steering. Think how small a member of our body and how much harm it can affect, or how much it can bless. The spoken word that we speak. And these are the thoughts that came out when I was listening to John's presentation here.
Lovely, Kitos Petri, so beautiful, in a very biblical and prophetic way, speaking to the tongue, its blessing and cause. So lovely, thank you.
You're welcome.
Now Maru, please. And any friends wishing to raise questions, please indicate in the chat. If Maruf is taking a bit of time, Minati, Sandhya Appa, Saji, Devendra, and Randhir.
Hello, am I audible? Yeah. Good evening, everyone. It is always very enlightening to listen to the lecture by Professor John Clemer, and it was very nice to listen to him in all the aspects of the most of this I liked, that listening and the deep questioning, those parts. Actually, this is not a question on this, like, formation of world is possible through literature. That is very much possible.
You are muting yourself, Minati.
Hello, am I audible now?
Yes.
Yeah, what I was telling that Professor Clemmer's that deep listening and questioning, that part I like the most. I mean, there are something also when you listen, you can listen beyond the words. I mean, whatever somebody says, beyond the words, you can listen. And one thought I was telling, he was telling now the transformation of world is possible through literature. That is very much possible. But in this current scenario, there is conflict, there is polarization. As a reader, you have to be very choosy whom to read. I mean, there is a contradiction of ideas, ideologies, and you have to choose whom to read and whose ideas to adopt. That is what I actually want to say about that. And today I want to say that much only. And thank you so much.
Thank you. You have met John many a time in Bangalore.
Yes, 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 yes.
So it's like our family
Yeah.
gathering. So
Yeah.
that's lovely. And now Sandhya Appa, please. Okay. Then हाँ तुम्हें ओडिया रे कहि दियो मु ट्रांसलेशन कर देबी हैला I'll translate it into English. Hello. Okay. Now
Hello.
हाँ તમે म्यूट कर देइछो अनम्यूट कर दियो. Hello, unmute कर दियो. Okay, she's taking a bit of time. And Shaji, please.
Sir John Clammer, thank you very much. This is Saji. We missed you on 2 occasions earlier, on the 18th and 25th. Hope to see you on 2nd, sir. As usual, it's very inspiring to listen to you. This is the first time that I'm introduced to Chittabhai, and it's a pleasure that the introduction is at your hands. Having heard from different larger aspects, I only have a small inquiry to understand further about the social discrimination that much of the underprivileged that go through in India, you are aware of, in terms of class, caste. Has Chittabhai, Chitranjan Jas, has he suggested any way of overcoming this? Because subalterns cannot speak. I'm quoting the words used by the people who have spoken for subalterns. So also the underprivileged in India cannot speak. The voice is unheard. How could they be heard? How could they be made to be heard? This is one thing. And you are aware also of the discrimination that is made in terms of religion in India, since you have lived in India. And he himself belonged to a state where discrimination is prevalent. Has he made anything in particular? Has he suggested any ways of overcoming this? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Saji. Maybe John, you may like to gather a few thoughts together and listen to you towards the end. And now, Devendra and Randhir, please.
Sir, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share my opinion, and I'm thankful to Professor John Clemer, sir, for introducing the thoughts of Chitranjan Das. Since I have been listening the discussions organized by Swadhyaya Center for Co-Learning. In my memory, it's third talk on Chitranjan Das. And with all the talks, although a little bit I was getting, but since the thoughts of Chitranjan Das were introduced and emphasized by John Clemer, sir, it was a kind of total understanding, and particularly three ideas were taken by John Clemer, sir. How the thoughts or suggestions of Chitranjan Das can transform the society, can bring change in society, can be helpful for providing a solution to the problem of society, particularly by literature, by education and methodology. I'm a student of English literature, so few quotations I have noted down in order to support 3 points: literature, education, and methodology. So I would like to quote William Shakespeare, particularly to give an example of methodology in one of his play, Hamlet. In Hamlet, there is a character, maybe a flawed character, Polonius, one of the minister in the court of the king. While guiding his son Laertes, who was going abroad for education, he was saying, neither a borrower nor a lender be, for loan oft loses both itself and friends, and borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry. So it is a kind of universal suggestion given by every elder to his ward or his student or his son. Talking of method, same character delivers a dialogue, and well written by William Shakespeare, while addressing the protagonist of the play, Hamlet, who has gone mad. Actually, he is not mad, he is pretending to be mad in order to avoid the gaze of people who were spying on him, because he was definitely there to take the revenge of death of his father. So he was pretending to be mad. So on his condition, Polonius points out, though this be madness, in condition of Hamlet was definitely he was behaving to be a madman. Though this be madness, yet there is a method in it. Polonius was a great observer. He says, yes, there is a method in the madness of Hamlet. To point out some other points, particularly education, our elders keep saying, all that glitters is not gold. This is a mighty line by William Shakespeare in one of his famous play, Merchant of Venice. Har chamakne wali cheez sona nahi hoti. We have to be cautious. We maybe be fooled by others. Moving further, to educate the people who are diverted from their paths, who are not able to find a way, I would like to quote Alfred Lord Tennyson, the flag bearer of Victorian age, a great poet, Alfred Lord Tennyson. In one of his poem Ulysses, he quotes, and that quotation is, for man, what a man is. Man is, actually, the quotation is, for man, made weak by time and fate. Man is made weak by time and fate, but strong in will. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. This is nature of man, taught by Alfred Lord Tennyson. And the last thing, last quotation, it is by Jonathan Swift, one of the writer of neoclassical age, the great satirist. Every man desires to live long. Everyone wants to live long, but no man wishes to be old. So these are some lines full of motivation, education, and of course, the words of Chitranjan Das, well presented by Professor John Clare, proves, yes, literature, education, and methodology can be a tool to remove all problems of society. So thank you for giving me this opportunity, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Devendra. Now, dear Randhir, please.
Thank you, Dr. Clammer. It was very, very deep thought. And when we think about authorship of literature, then we have to think how literature that is quarantined to a few elites or hegemonized by few elites and can be made to relate to the masses for and about whom it is written. It is believed that literature mirrors society, but it goes beyond society and tries to instruct in the right behavior, proper behavior patterns. So how to make literature to the masses who may never read these books, like Rikshawala, like Dalits, and how Chitranjan Das, think about this question to making literature to available to all. Thank you.
Thank you, Randhir. So now, John, please.
Some quick reflections that are on these very important issues that you've all raised. Thank you. Maybe I start with Saji's point, because I think that's also reflected in some of the other questions that were asked. I think probably, this question of the voice of the subaltern. Well, I can't speak directly for Chittabhai, but I would think that these two things spring to mind. One is, of course, the nature of education itself, education that has those kind of qualities that we were talking about earlier. And to ensure, and again, that maybe relates to this question, that Randhir's question about literature too, that the content of that education actually speaks to the life conditions of the people to whom it's directed. And so much doesn't. I mean, if you look at so many, textbooks, school textbooks, they have very little to do with the actual life condition of the children who are forced to read those things. Even their history may not be taught to them. In fact, history, I think, is very powerful too in this respect. Rarely, I think, are we taught the history of our own locality maybe social group. You know, there are scholars who talk about Dalit history, for example, but to find this actually taught in a school would be something different, and I think very, very revelatory. And I think there are parallels to this too, which is particularly in feminism, in gender issues. You know, having ideas about history and society taught from the perspective of gender, instead of just assuming a male version of how reality is to be structured, opens up people's imagination. So I think it can be literature in this form. So the question there, I think, Saji, is really, I mean, education, but education that reflects the experience of the people to whom that education is directed. And so much education is not like that. It's a risky enterprise, of course, because you're breaking away from the classical mold. And I think you're often up against institutions like the Ministry of Education, which doesn't like this. You know, you're not following the syllabus that some education bureaucrats have determined should be the content of whatever has to be taught in schools. Oh, certainly of course, in national schools, but in private schools, I guess there's a different basis, right? This may not only be literature. A friend, I think one or two of us, I think Ananta knows, Amitava Bhattacharya, Calcutta-based painter. And he's worked in a number of places in Purulia, in West Bengal, in Madhya Pradesh, and other places, working with tribal children through visual art. And he's written a little book, which is not widely available. Unfortunately, the book was only a very small number printed, called The Diary of an Art Master. And what that wonderful little book is actually about the transformative effect of visual arts as well. Children who never painted, and children who began, when they realized, they were given this, they didn't have the material, nobody encouraged them ever to do this. Once they got the idea of what they could do, the creativity that flowed from that was extraordinary. Because, of course, what they painted was quite naturally what they saw in their own experience. Yeah, they were painting, trying to represent something about their lives. So I think this question of to paraphrase Marx, what should we say? Cultural workers of the world unite. We have nothing to lose except our paintbrushes. That in fact, this is often forgotten. I think in, for example, development discourse generally is in fact the profoundly transformative effects of culture itself. But not necessarily, so-called high culture imposed, again, as Osman says, from the top down, but stuff that's allowed to arise once you find the triggers of creativity in people. Once you get their imagination going, you would be amazed what they would come up with. So I think that applies also to literature, Randhir. I mean, that quality of literature is one issue, but there's also the question of its accessibility in terms of its themes, its language, and that kind of thing. And I think, again, not so much attention is given to that. Chittabhai did that, of course. I mean, he wrote things for children, for example, that were designed to be easily assimilated by smaller children, but that were not simply, fantasy tales, which enabled them, I think, to engage with the sort of reality they saw around them, nature and society, particularly. I mean, there are parallels to this. I mean, some of you may have heard of the famous Brazilian educationalist Paulo Freire, who tried more or less the same thing when he began as a young man, went to, do social service in the countryside, trying to teach literacy to Brazilian peasants. Come home from the field, tired in the evening, cutting sugarcane all day. The last thing they wanted was this young guy trying to write on the board, this is a dog, the dog is black, the dog has, white tail, or something like that. For goodness sake. It was when he made famous breakthrough, he reports in one of his books, that one day he said, this is not working. He said, let's try a different approach. Said, on the board, he said, let me write this. The landlord is fat, but you are all thin. Why is the landlord fat and you are all skinny? Good question. Well, why indeed is the landlord fat, right? And we are not, right? And of course, that immediately linked their actual life experience to, in that case, the acquisition of literacy. And Freire developed a whole theory and a whole methodology of literacy teaching out of this. That literacy is a form of empowerment Okay, I think that's part of the answer to all of your questions. The other answer is the thing. I think that Chittabhai himself raises the point that, as I suggested earlier, this is an open-ended process. Once you trigger people's imagination, you don't know where it will go, and you shouldn't know where it will go. I think there's a very strong tendency to try to create something that then I want to control. I want to control the flow of what I've triggered. You can't really do that. Okay, and you have to have, I think, the trust in people that allows, in that case, the subaltern, once you've planted these ideas, once you started that imaginative process going, is to allow it to flow where it will go. That's not your problem. That's their problem. You might be able to help with helping them encapsulate that in some form, but it's really their own vitality and their own autonomy that you have, I think, revealed to them, and then you have to stand back. Okay, that's partly an answer, I hope, to everybody's question, Ananta, but I'm not sure if I really satisfied everybody. Right?
No. Question, it is very much a part of a dialogue, and it is also a connected journey. And in terms of really being with people and just as being with people in different occasions and just to initiate a few ripples and then it moves. And that is how Chittabhai worked with children and also people suffering from natural disasters. For example, in 1999, more than 20 years ago, we had a super cyclone. In these very difficult moments, there were initiatives of working with children and the people affected by super cyclones. So how do we really create a possibilities for a new existence? So thank you, John, for holding our hands and working together. We look forward to learning more together.
Dr. Devendra, I would like to invite Dr. Devendra to give a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, sir, for giving me the opportunity. I'm thankful to everybody for joining us and making this event great success. On behalf of Swadhyaya Sahachakra School for Asian Blossoming, Puducherry and Chennai, I would like to extend my vote of thanks to everybody from bottom of my heart. And in that order, my head is bowing in gratitude to Professor John Clemer for such a brilliant presentation and answering the questions and making everybody's, means I could hear the comments from other participants as well. And this is my personal experience as well, for making us understand the ideology of Chitranjan Das. So, sir, on behalf of entire organizing team, I'm expressing my gratitude to your good self. Thank you very much, sir. I would like to express my deep sense of gratitude to Professor Giri, sir, for moderating the session with such a benign way that it is like a river is flowing and thoughts are coming. So, sir, it was so kind of you to moderate the session. And discussant like Professor Saji Vardi sir, Abdul Qadir sir, and Minati Pradhanji, and all who were the part of this journey of learning and going together. Sir, my heart is filled with gratitude to everybody. So I'm thankful to you all. Thanks a lot. And last but not the least, how can I forget to mention the name of organizer of the event, Professor Randhir Gautam, for planning and executing everything. So I'm thankful to Randhir Gautam sir also. So that's it. Namaste. And once again, thanks
Thank you. I would like to say something. Devendra sir, you have been giving vote of thanks for week after week, I mean, days after days. So it is a thanks from us to you to give all the vote of thanks all the time.
Most welcome.
And let us all wish John a good morning because he's already in good morning.
Good morning in Japan.
And
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
beautiful rest with these stars.
Thank you.